Spaces where you exit. Keep your head up. Press your foot on the pedal and never let up. If they say that you can't, that's when you get up and stand. Show them you can. Baby, you know you got it. Please don't let nothing stop it. What other option but to? And no matter the hate, just remember you're great. Shout out and say Vanguard for the.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Amber Reese, and welcome to another episode of the Amb Perspective with my special guest, Mr. Keith Jones, everybody.
Hello, everyone, and Amber, thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here.
You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. It's a funny story. I remember you from like 20, I believe it was 2011, maybe 2010, because it was my junior year of high school.
Okay.
And I used to do these trips with this guy who was disabled. He had spinal cord injury, Mr. John Esty. Shout out to him. But anyway, he took us to this convention my junior year, and Mr. Keith was one of the speakers. And I remember you saying something, and it was either me or my cousin who laughed in the audience because you asked who laughed. But I think it was me because my cousin was like, she did. And I just fell in love with your story then. I remember watching your PBS special. I think it was that same year. And I just was like, I got to get him on the show now that I'm up and running to let him know that, because you told me when we got to meet backstage that I was going to do great things. Yes. I didn't know what it was going to be. But I think I told you at the time I wanted to do journalism school. And yes. But things happen. So now I'm host. So now we got this popping. So.
Well, congratulations. And you are doing big things. That's what's up.
For sure. So my first question, for the viewers that don't know, what is your disability? And were you diagnosed at birth, or did this happen over time?
Okay. My name is Keith Jones. I'm an African-American male wearing eyeglasses. And I am a person with cerebral palsy. I think they, depending, when your family tell you stories about how you came about, Black folks tell you on all kinds of very Black folks kind of way. But I believe they did not know necessarily I had cerebral palsy until I was roughly 8 months. And just for your listeners, for the context of this, the diagnosis, the way people talk about disability now was not how people talked about disability at the end of the 60s, early 70s. And being born at the end of the 60s, they were calling it birth defects, and that we had brain damage.
Right.
So so it's been from birth.
Right. So with having cerebral palsy, because like myself, did you struggle with it as a kid? Because you said back in the day, it was known as birth defects. And we were also being institutionalized because, to paint a picture for the viewers, disability was not a thing back then. There was no inclusion. We were being institutionalized. That didn't really come around till the 80s and the 90s. And we're still working towards inclusion and inclusivity, as well as showing people that we can be independent.
Yeah, it was and is a different time. There are stages. So now we are post ADA. We have the ADA on books. That's the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have the Handicapped Education Children Act, which then turned into the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We just celebrated Section 504, and we just celebrated the Rehab Act. So all of those things have happened within my lifetime. And people who were born post 1990 or 19, or the generation of people with disabilities who were born with quote unquote protections, at least in terms of access to schools, the right to live in a community, the right to have your services met and things like that. But prior to that, either now, if you ever study the disability rights or disability history movement, or now what we are talking about, disability justice, all of those things were started because people were being institutionalized. People weren't being able to live in their homes. Like if you wanted to live on your own, you weren't getting in the part. Like the term accessible housing really is maybe 30 years old, 40 if you want to push it. So a lot of these things that people are talking about, and especially coming up now for the younger people, is that people tend to forget that it has never been always like this. Like a lot of the disability rights, disability justice, and all of these movements are only decades old. They're not centuries old, and they are still growing. So it's interesting now because I'm an old man with gray hair and no hairline. Like that, to see the evolution of how our existence, whether or not being on TV or just being accepted, has changed and evolved over the last 5 decades.
Right. So you are a rapper, motivational speaker. Is there anything more that you would want to add to your list?
I'm fantastic. No. So technically, when people introduce me or when I introduce myself in this, I'm the president, CEO of my company, Soul Touch and Experiences, and we LLC. We've been around for we're celebrating 25 years this year. And in terms of my activism, can go 30, 35 years. But my list, like when people describe me, it's always funny because depending on where I am, I'm either a motivational speaker, a keynote speaker, a presenter, an activist, an advocate. So I just show up and say I'm Keith and I'm Black and I'm sexy and all that good stuff. But if I had to make a list, it would be human rights activist and advocate, entrepreneur, father, and son, and just all around a person who, as an artist, enjoys all things art and music. But yes, my performance area is definitely hip hop. So, but I do a whole bunch of other stuff too.
Yes, well, of course, advocacy is definitely important. So when did you know that you were ready to step on the front line and start advocating for people like myself and yourself?
Well, not too fine a point on it, since the word go, right? There's, I think what people want to talk about in the disability community is like disability is over here and make it separate from being a Black woman or being a Black man in America. Those are very, very distinct existences. If you're First Nation and you're a person with a disability, that is a very distinct existence, because as much as people are focusing on Palestine, and rightly so, or in the Congo, rightly so, we are also in a place where there are people who are waking up every day and being reminded that their land is occupied. And as a person who is, descendant of enslaved people or stolen people, we are the people on this. So when I learned, or just growing up in St. Louis in the 60s and the 70s, remember, there was no inclusive schools. So they weren't necessarily trying to teach us. So I was advocating at a very early age, because I was not trying to go home to my mama and not be smart, right? Like I wasn't like there's always an expectation of go get educated, get good grades, be a decent human, turn out to be a decent adult. So from birth, it's been that. But in terms of for the larger community, I really stepped into this kind of by accident in '94 because I had no desire to be in the trenches fighting. I just wanted to be, but by circumstances of being a Black man with a disability and running into the challenges that we face as people with disabilities, it kind of led me to a path where if I can fix it for everybody, I'm fixing it for myself. So that's kind of how I got here.
Right. So I know you said, growing up, you always wanted to make sure that, you was coming home, learning things.
Yeah.
So I know for me, when I was in the second grade, I did mainstream classes. And for those that don't know, that's basically you going into regular ed classes. The only special ed class I had was math. So how is that different then versus around the time I was growing up? Did you do anything like that?
So the concept of mainstreaming started roughly in the late '70s. So I was like 10 or 11. I mean, there was involuntary mainstreaming because you might be the only kid with a disability in the entire town, so you just got put into classrooms, or you just didn't go. The concept of mainstreaming, what we now call inclusive education, it was spotty because the regulations that allowed us to be in classrooms was not really signed fully until like 1977, 78, even though the Brown versus Board of Education decision allowed everybody to go to school. And that was some 15 to 20 years prior. So mainstreaming for me was a fight that my mother and I consistently took on because, again, prior to 1990, and I graduated high school, I'm telling my age, in 1988. Right? There wasn't the fight to have me just in regular classes was a consistent fight, even though we had federal law. So the way it is now, it's different now because you have more rights to, you have the IEP, the Individual Education Plan. You may have had it in the '80s, but it has more weight now. You did not have civil rights laws in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act because none of that happened in the '80s. All of that is post '90. So inclusion post 1990 was supposed to be, like for you, easier, right? It's supposed to be for kids with disabilities to not have to still fight to have teachers have us in regular classrooms. So mainstreaming was all I knew from like the middle of the sixth grade on. But my homeroom was still special ed. And we still were those kids in that classroom. But the difference between then and now is that it's actually like you have the right to be there versus prior to that, even though the laws were on the books, like people didn't think you had the right to exist at all. So, it's still not perfect. It's not the way it should be, but I have much more hope than I did as a kid because we have laws, but the fighting for you to be able to go to college is still the fight. The fight for kids who are not seen as students to be educated is still the fight. So yeah, it's changed, but it's still kind of the same.
Right. I mean, for me growing up as a kid, I was smart early on. So my mom when she recognized that, it was like, yeah, we got to get her in there. I don't want my baby to be, you know what I'm saying, a
Right,
vegetable. And
right.
she made sure summers, I was going to summer school, even though I didn't get bad grades. I was going to summer school because she said she didn't want to turn my brain to turn into mush.
Right, right.
So she was very like up on it. PPT meetings, for those that don't know what a PPT meeting is, it's an annual meeting that we have every year to discuss goals for your child that may have a disability. And
Right.
then, but she had me in the forefront of that. I remember going to my first one at 8 years old.
Yeah.
And then just not really, probably even younger than that, because I did the birth to three program. So
Okay.
um she just basically had me in the forefront. And then when I was getting old enough to speak, especially when I got into high school, it's like, no, I don't want to do that. No, we
Right,
keep,
right, right.
like, yeah, we keep that. Oh, make sure this is added because I need to make sure I'm getting in from class early, leaving class early. So yeah.
Right. And it's funny is I'm listening because I remember sitting in high school. I started high school for your listeners last century a while ago. So we going to, 2000s are only 23 years. I'm like way over 23 years old. So when I started high school, in school, like you said, my mother was the leading driving force. My family was that force. About being people who came up from the Mississippi Delta, up the Mississippi River in the 30s and the 40s, into St. Louis in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and having kids in the 60s and 70s, and seeing how America treated us. And then you add a disability to it, and then having to sit in classrooms where there weren't teachers that looked like me. There were teachers, and when we did run across teachers of color, then we ran into that next line of, okay, we black, but I got a disability, so I'm not black, right? But the IEP meetings were about me not disappointing my mother and being like, okay, I'm gonna get good grades so I don't make her mad, right? So I can go on and do these things that, for a lot of black people in this country, the 50s, the 60s, even now, is seen as mandatory or necessary, or if you didn't do it, you would be trapped in the system in which racism and classism will keep you poor. And so if you came from a household, you were, because I couldn't just go get a job at Burger King flipping burgers. I'm not sure if palsy didn't allow that. I had to be educated. I had to be smart. My mother was not going to tolerate me coming home and not being educated. So a lot of that stuff, even later on in high school, was about, no, I'm not going to go sit in the classroom for 4 days and just color circles. Like, I'm trying to be an aeronautical engineer. I got things to do. I'm trying to be,
Hey.
you know what I mean? I'm trying to be a rapper. I got things to do, right? Like, I'm trying to go, at the time, I was trying to go to, I think, two schools. I was either trying to go to MIT or Wentworth Institute on Technology because I wanted to be a computer programmer. And again, this is, we're talking on devices now. Like, none of this existed. And all of these things were seen on TV shows as futuristic. And so when you talked about, classroom accommodations, getting note takers or being in class early enough, or my high school was obnoxiously big. And they would give me a class on one side of the building. So here's something for you, Amber. My high school had 5 floors. The fourth and the fifth floors were not connected. So in order to get from the 5th floor on one side, you had to go down to the 3rd floor, all the way to the other. So yeah.
Wow.
But again, coming up and being in classrooms, I think education was really about making sure that, one, that I was educated, and one, that we didn't not get caught into, what America has consistently perpetuated about being Black in America.
How was that for you in your journey of independence?
My independence journey was interesting. Because we talk about independence in different ways now, and so independence in the disability community at large is a very much a white centric nuclear family type discussion, and your independence is to be separate and apart from that and to live, whatever. Um, but you come from a culture where you got multi-generational homes, but you still want to be an adult. What does that independence look like? My independence journey, like, didn't really kick into full tilt gear once I got out of my mama's house. Because are you really independent when you're living in your mama's house, right? Like 16, 17, like, because it ain't your house. I mean, you independent. You doing your thing. But yeah, you come to your mom and your daddy's house acting crazy. You are going to find out what real independence is when when you have to go pay bills. But once I got into college, learning how to negotiate schedules and things like that, because nobody talks about when you drop your 18-year-old off to college. It's like you're literally asking them to have responsibilities that they've never been prepped for, in terms of like management of time, resource, and things like that. But my independence journey started there, and has always been, about wanting to just be myself. And usually what they came with was fighting to find housing that I could actually get the wheelchair in. Or I would have to make a decision about taking a house, and the wheelchair would have to sit somewhere until I needed to go outside of the house. And over the past couple of decades, that independence journey really has not, it's more about now, once I became a parent, having to fight, perceptions of, can people with disabilities raise kids? Because then my independence was questioned. Like, why don't you have somebody with you all the time? Because you're taking care of your child, your children. So that independence journey is even now, because my youngest are twins, and because of life circumstances, the challenge of going into a courtroom to fight for child custody or visitation or anything like that, now your independence is questioned as well as your competence. Like, as a person with a disability, we're not allowed to have bad relationships. We're not allowed to break up and be, human. And so the independence is interesting because depending on what the circumstance is, people will absolutely question whether or not you should be independent. And then in other circumstances, they're demanding you to be completely independent from your support network in order to get anything. So it's this weird kind of like, moment to moment journey where you just sit there and go, God, people are stupid, but okay, I'll be all right. It's like, so the journey started, once I left my mama's house in terms of like fully becoming an independent adult, but it is a constant evolution.
What do you hope people take away from you?
I mean, I hope that when I show up in spaces, like, I was fortunate enough to meet you years ago, right? I hope that when I come across somebody such as yourself or other individuals in these spaces that are intentional, that I leave them, at worst, I leave you neutral, right? Like, you like, okay, whatever. But at best, I hope that if anything, if whether it's sharing my struggle or information, that you understand the strength that is within you, your skill set, your tools, your talent, and understand the uniqueness of that, and that the standards that you need to set, the standards that people are holding you to sometimes are standards that they're trying to hold that they can't meet themselves, right? So I'm hoping that people, at worst, it's like, okay, he was whatever, but at best, they have the ability to find themselves and to move in their life's journey the way that they see fit, as long as they're not doing harm to other people, but really basking in the glow of their humanity and their uniqueness.
That is awesome. That is awesome. Well, we have 7 minutes remaining.
Okay.
But I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions.
Sure.
So let's get away from advocacy and all things disability. So you're a dad.
Yeah.
So I know for me personally, I was kind of hesitant about having kids, but now that I'm 30, carry the I'm 3. Hello. But I just wanted to know, how did you navigate fatherhood, and when was the exact moment? Like, did you toy with the fact of not having children or having children as well?
Uh, it's funny. I always, in my mind, as a kid growing up, I was like, I'm gonna get married. I'm gonna have 5 kids. We gonna have a daughter. Like I was just weird enough. I always have, in my mind, I was gonna have 5 kids. Um, but then the challenge of dating in order to get to the kid making part was always the thing, because disability, for better or for worse, would pop up as either a hindrance or barrier to relationships. But once I managed to figure out that at least crack that egg for a little bit, being a parent, any first time a parent will tell you, we don't know what the we doing. Um, I figured out how to change diapers with my feet real quick. My son was born, God, he's gonna be 29. Um, so changing diapers with feet and making bottles, and then I had my daughter, my oldest daughter, like 13 years after him, went back into, you finally got one to the point where you ain't got to do nothing for them. Then you got to start again, and navigating that. And then now my twins will be 10 in July. So the navigation really wasn't about parenting, actually, outside of just trying to make sure that they're healthy, because I got, it really was the doubting of my ability to take care of my kids, which was odd because some of the places that was coming from were from their parent, were from the other parent, which is weird to me. It's like, now you gonna start questioning whether or not I can do something. It's a little too late because the baby is here already. But negotiating parenthood, I say, if you want to be a parent, whether you're disabled or not, it's your humanity and it is your right. But understand that the kids did not ask to be here, and that it's always a challenge to take care of another human, particularly when you have to take care of yourself as well.
That is awesome. And my last question to you is, what do you hope they see when they look at you?
They daddy, the cool, the daddy that is chill up until they get crazy. The daddy that will, I'm the silly parent. Like I'm the parent that make up the crazy songs, run around the house and chase everybody, and then play video games and talk trash to you. Ask my son, I'll beat him down every time. And with and with my daughters, I've been wearing tiaras and they have tea parties and some fashion. I'm a fashionista, video game gangster daddy who does everything. So I hope, I just hope that I turn out, when they get out into the world, that they are confident and strong enough in themselves to withstand what we are facing in this world. So that's what I hope they see.
Well, Mr. Keith, I want to say thank you for coming on. I want to say what you're doing is utterly amazing. I love your content. Keep doing what you're doing. Do you have any questions for me before we go?
The only thing I have to say is I am so proud. I get to see you now. Like, look, see that did it. Look, I didn't ruin you. Hooray! No, it's like no. So they.
Well, guys, that wraps up today's episode of the Amb Perspective with guest Keith Jones. As always, stay positive, be blessed, and I pray that you take away from this episode you can do anything you put your mind to. Bye, y'all.
Bye, y'all.